wenn es um das Thema Change Management und vor allem ums Thema Lean Change Management geht. Agile, 18 years later, er steht bereits da und richtet die Technik ein. Und er ist ready. Einen tosenden Applaus. Herzlich willkommen, Jason Little.
Thank you. Welcome and thanks for having me here today. What I wanted to do was to take a look at the last 10 years, 12 years, 13 years of patterns that I've seen in the Agile community. And first I wanted to take us on a little bit of a history trip on what was going on in 2001 when the Manifesto was created. Does everybody remember Clippy? Who remembers Clippy? Our good buddy Clippy. Clippy doesn't exist anymore. And the iPod, the first time when you could carry more than 1,000 songs in your pocket. And Microsoft dominated the technology landscape. These were the companies that ruled the world. This is the global 500 of the most profitable companies. I wonder what the list looks like today. Let's see how agile these guys are. In 3, 2, 1, oh. So Walmart's doing pretty well. Walmart must have read the Manifesto, but especially Mitsubishi, I guess they mustn't have read the Manifesto because they dropped from number 9 down to 129th place as of last year. What about movies? Who's seen Endgame so far? Show of hands, Endgame. Nope, not that many, okay. So maybe it's just a North American thing, but we're still, back in 2001, we weren't tired of comic book movies yet. There wasn't one being released every week. But interesting enough, Avengers Endgame has outgrossed all of those in just 20 days, I believe. So in 2001, different set of movies were popular. Music was just as bad in 2001 as it is today. All of this popular stuff that my kids listen to, except for, of course, Lenny Kravitz, who made number 9 and single-handedly made 2001 a tolerable year for music. So things are quite different now. What was happening for me in 2001? Well, it was the first time I got fired, so that's a good thing, I guess, sort of. So I was working for an organization where we were selling CRM systems for $2.5 million that you can largely get for free now. Who's heard of this new technology called WordPress? Yeah, so WordPress and Sugar CRM basically took down our entire company. But the interesting thing about this story in 2001 was the way that it happened. So I come in on a Monday morning, and it's time for the all-company town hall. So who works in a company where they do this? They do a town hall every quarter, whatever it is. They get everybody in the room. They talk about how agile we're going to be or whatever. And in this organization, same thing, but they broke us into different meeting rooms. So we're scattered across a 10-story building, and we're all sitting there in meeting rooms just wondering what's gonna happen today. And on the phone, I don't know if it was the CEO or the head of HR said, okay, well, here's what's really happening today. We're letting go of 60% of our staff. And everybody kind of froze up a little bit. So what's going to happen is Manager X is going to come in and tell you exactly what is going to be going on with the group in your room. So if anyone remembers American Idol or any of these live reality TV shows where they kind of walk in and they go, who's moving on to the next round? That's kind of what it was like. So when the managers came into the room, they went, yes, we're letting go of 60% of the people, unfortunately, but the good news is you guys are all safe. But odds are you're working with someone that is going to be told in the same meeting on another floor they have 5 minutes to go to their desk and clean out their and get out. So have a little empathy for them. And I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. So I survived the first round, which was great. I was working as a web developer in the marketing group. And then the invite comes out for the next town hall. So everybody's like, ooh, okay. So we go into the little rooms again. And the voice comes up on the phone, and then everybody's sitting around going, oh, well, I work with him, and he's really good, so I'm probably okay, but that guy's a little sketchy. I'm not sure. So we all sit around, and then they come in the room, and they go, you're safe. Oh, survived another round. And just because, what the heck, they did it a third time another couple of weeks later. So 2001 was a very interesting year for me, and I decided, well, let's not go through this again because this wasn't exactly very good for my stress level. So I'll start my own company and start building stuff. And much like WordPress, MailChimp didn't exist back then. Has anybody heard of MailChimp? Yeah. So that stuff didn't exist back then. And if anyone remembers the Harlequin romance books, does anybody remember the company Harlequin that would write these? My mom always used to read these things. So we always had a stack of these Harlequin books. And I actually wrote their newsletter engine back then using Microsoft Exchange Server event syncs. Anyone old enough to remember how to integrate into Microsoft Exchange Server? No? No. So back then, you couldn't just subscribe to MailChimp for free. You had to spend $2 million so I could build something for you that said, if somebody gets an out-of-office reply, don't unsubscribe them from the mailing list. Just flag that, it's a soft bounce. Had to program that stuff. And finally, in 2001, I worked for a startup where before iPhones existed, you'd have to pay $3 to get a little crappy picture on your flip phone, your Samsung flip phone. Did anybody ever buy ringtones for their phones in the early 2000s? Yeah, our company was the first in North America that built ringtones and screensavers that you could download. So there were 3 of us, and our music licensing person would send an email out, and he would say, here's the 11 songs that I was able to get a license for. Does anybody work in music industry at all or understands anything about music licensing? Yeah, it's very complicated. Somehow everybody wants 150% of the royalty from the publishing company to the artists to everyone else, and we're sitting there going, well, wait a minute. If we're paying out 900% of how do we make money? So we'd get a list of songs, and our music licensing person would say, who knows these songs? Can you make them in MIDI? And then we'd sit down on the keyboard and we'd hammer out these little MIDI songs, and we'd charge you guys $3 or $4 for beep, boop, boop, beep, beep, boop. And people paid it, which was crazy. So now, of course, none of this stuff exists anymore. And I guess, the whole point is now 2001 is when the Agile Manifesto was created. Is there anyone who's not familiar with the Agile Manifesto? You never know. Oh, one. Okay, good. He's probably just being funny. So in 2001, the manifesto was what Martin Fowler called a call to arms. It was a statement of their beliefs about how to build better software. And recently at one of the big Agile conferences, they had some of the manifesto signatories come back and talk about what's changed for them. I think it was their 10th anniversary of the Agile Alliance conference over in North America, just to get an impression about what's different, what's changed over the 10 years. So there is a company called Version 1 that has released the State of Agile Development Survey every year for the last 13 years. I think this year is their 14th year. Has anybody seen or heard of that report? Okay, so they poll companies and they ask things like, why are you choosing Agile? What benefits are you getting? What methods and practices are you using? What's working, what's not, etc. And the questions have changed over time. So I just have a few pieces of data to show, and we can take a look at some trends and kind of draw our own conclusion. What's happened over the last number of years, and what's next? So these are the responses. And you'll notice that, after 2015, they tanked a little bit. 2016, they didn't publish. They just said thousands of people replied, but they didn't say. So in one sense, you could say Agile was, they were a little bit ahead of their time up here. And now there are, I don't even know how many of these reports exist today. But that could probably explain why there's been a bit of a dip. But either way, there's a good sample size to go from. And why Agile? Why are companies choosing Agile? It's often the interpretation is faster, better, cheaper, right? How many people have been in an organization where Agile is going to solve everything because once our 1-year transformation program is done, like we're totally Agile? Does it work? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes somewhere in the middle. But these are the most common reasons, and they've stayed more or less the same. Accelerate time to market, that's the dark red bar in the middle. managing changing priorities at the bottom, better alignment of business and IT, and increased productivity. The interesting thing about all of those, none of them really speak to having a more humane workforce, or improved morale, or any of the stuff that reflects the left side of the manifesto. But either way, the reasons are the same over the last 13 years. Now, what about who's responding? This one's pretty interesting. So they asked people, what's your job title? Who's actually responding and putting data in this? The most interesting thing, and one of the trends that I've seen is project managers just get renamed as Scrum Masters. Does that happen for anyone? So we're Agile now. I don't see project manager in those 3 roles of Scrum. Well, I guess we'll just call you guys Scrum Masters now. How's that sound? And they're like, yeah, sure. Do I get more money? So you can imagine with more coaches and Scrum Masters replying to this, you're probably getting more of a perspective of, obviously, of that group of people. And they added that role a little bit later on in the survey, so it was dominated by project managers, team leads, program managers, but I guess most of those folks have been relabeled as coaches and Scrum Masters. So we are getting a pretty good spread of responses from people. Now, this one, what methods are the most popular in Agile? Raise your hand if your company is doing some flavor of Scrum in one way or another. What about extreme programming? Just extreme programming, the technical and the process part of it. Yeah, very minor. So you can see Scrum and the green has been much more popular. Scrum and XP was popular, in the mid-2000s, where people would use Scrum for their process part and obviously incorporate some of the technical practices, collective code ownership, TDD, whole team commitment, on-site customer, that type of stuff. And that's dropped off. And then it's hard to see the little green line, but this is extreme programming in 2007, people using just extreme programming, and now it's 1%. Could be, maybe that's just how people work now. Maybe people just intrinsically use the technical practices. I'm not sure. What I've seen is less focus on technical, because the process stuff's pretty simple, right? You look at Scrum, it's a really, really easy framework to get started with. And the Agile process stuff is really simple. The technical stuff is really, really hard. So hybrid and custom is on the rise as well from a lot of the responses. And that's where you go into an organization and go, yeah, we started this Agile transformation 5 years ago, and we're Agile, but it's not true Agile. It's kind of hybrid Agile. And what does hybrid Agile mean? Sometimes it means, well, real Agile was too hard, so we said screw that, and we just decided not to follow some of these practices. And in some cases, hybrid Agile is a good thing. It means we've adapted to our context. I just came back from visiting, I guess, a medium-sized organization where most of their teams do a stand-up once a week, maybe twice a week, but they're in the same room and they collaborate all day. So we're Scrum, but we don't do stand-ups every day because they don't make sense in our context. So they knew well enough when to break the rule. They didn't break the rule just because the rule was too hard. So that could be 2 sides of why hybrid and custom has become more popular over the years. And my favorite, the barriers. Why are we getting stuck with Agile? The 4 reasons, you probably can't see those at the back: failure to change culture, resistance to change, lack of skills, and lack of management support are the top reasons, and that's by stack in the chart. Those aren't really Agile problems. Failure to change culture has been hovering around 52-53% since 2006 when this first came out. So it's either a really hard problem, or as a community we're not getting any brighter because we haven't really moved the needle on any of these problems. My favorite one is resistance to change, which basically says, okay, if I'm coming in to help you with Agile and it doesn't work, I can just go, for shame. I did everything I could, but you people resisted. So see you later. I'm out of here. I'm not a believer in resistance to change. I believe that if it's the perception of the person who's trying to change something, and it's feedback. It's an input that hopefully should guide us towards a different conversation. And it's usually because people don't feel they have a choice. It's just the next thing that's been handed down through what is often called dropping the change through the hole in the floor, where it's dropped in from the top, and then it's just left for the people down at the bottom to try to figure it out. And then it's often perceived as resistance. Those people are resisting. The interesting part is lack of skill and lack of management support has kind of gone through a bit of a wave over the 13 years. It was high at the beginning because Agile was kind of new. It dipped a little bit, and now it's started to come back up again. That it's really those people don't have the skills, or those managers aren't supporting. But it's all coming from a place of me as the sponsor for Agile, or me as the change person that's trying to push this out, and I'm not seeing the outcomes that I want to get. So patterns, the same. Same patterns year in and year out. And now we're going to look at a couple of new things that have popped up on the State of Agile survey. They've added quite a bit of scaling stuff. Who's using a scaling method in their organizations? Less, Nexus, Scrum of Scrum, SAFe, Disciplined Agile Delivery. Yeah, it was 2015 is when those questions started popping up. So you can see the influence of the market on the survey itself. As ideas grow and expand, they become more formal. And as they become more formal, we need to move away from the left side of the manifesto towards the right, create consistency, create standard practices, all of these types of things that probably weren't the intent of the manifesto, but that's just where the market is going. So these were the most popular scaling frameworks. Scrum of Scrums, 72% in 2015, and then it dropped to 16% as of 2018, because more things have popped up. Every week, Google Agile Scaling Framework. You'll probably get 10 million results. Now, what's been getting better? So if you remember the reasons for adopting Agile, the patterns were all things that were related to faster, better, cheaper. And none of them were related to morale, but we are seeing some kind of improvement. Number 4, this is from last year's report. So we're getting kind of a benefit of being able to change priorities. We're getting better visibility. We're getting better alignment. Yeah, and even though we don't really care about morale, sometimes that's getting a little bit better, which I guess that's kind of a good thing. The disturbing thing for me is all of the good engineering stuff, better quality, engineering discipline, maintainability, is all at the bottom. So that stuff's not getting better. The managing changing priorities is interesting. Let's just change whatever we want, whenever we want. We're Agile. Is a lot of the attitude that I see in some organizations, and we forget that there's a cost to switching stuff and changing our priorities. But it is pretty interesting that we are getting some of these benefits, but really all the technical stuff just seems to be getting lost. Quality doesn't really improve very much. Maintainability doesn't improve. It's still too hard to get stuff out the door, but our process works really well. Recently, they have started adding tips for success. So what has for our organizations that are seeing improvements, what are some of the tips for being successful? And those are things like executive sponsorship, training and consultants, common tools, internal coaches, consistent processes. Coaches has trended up. It's the salmon color here. So over the last 3 surveys, people find that having internal coaching capability is something that helps. But it is still pretty disturbing that common tools and common processes are up at the top of that list as well. Maybe not the intent of what the manifesto was. And then the last 2 years, they stopped using percentages of responses. So all the data I showed so far is, please pick the most important reasons for adopting Agile. You can pick more than one. So they just take a percentage of all the different responses. And for these tips, it's basically, here's the top 5 things that people have responded with over the course of the survey. Executive sponsorship was number 5 in 2017, moved up to number 2 in 2018. So you can take some of this data for what you will. There's an interactive version of this report on adecadeofagile.com if you want to check it out. My hope was to just open source it and let people do whatever they want with it. But still, it's some interesting data that allows us to have a different type of conversation when we want to move to Agile. There are some banks in Australia that are using new ways of working language. Has anyone heard that term before? Agile has too much baggage nowadays, so people are shifting to, let's just talk about new ways of working instead of Agile. If there are any stand-up comedy fans, if you remember George Carlin, he would have had a field day with that language. Spooky language. Doesn't really talk about the problem. So all of the surveys have kind of shifted towards things that are important if you value the right side of the manifesto. And that isn't necessarily what the intent was. The intent was, we value the items on the left side of the manifesto more. It doesn't mean the stuff on the right side is not important. It's just not the primary focus if we want to have a more humane organization and if we want to build better products. So we're kind of, we've kind of hit the late adopter stage of Agile, if you will. In one case, you could say Agile's become a racket. There's just, in Toronto alone, where I'm from, there's 12 meetup groups easily. Back in the late 90s, there was the Extreme Programming Group that started up in Toronto. And it's like the same 13 of us every month going to those meetups. And now, every night and every weekend, there's an Agile this, that, or other meetup. Conferences. A friend of mine, Alan Gottsteiner, was at the first Agile Alliance conference. Has anybody been to that one in North America? The big one, 3,000-ish people they'll get every year. And the first year, it was 10 of them sitting around a table talking about stuff. And now there are hundreds and thousands of Agile conferences everywhere. Used to only be a couple. And this is the nature of all ideas. Once ideas start to become mainstream, everyone jumps on, and it gets a little more confusing. Has anybody seen the kind of the arguments between the different camps? The Scrum people don't like Kanban, the Kanban people don't like the Scrum people, nobody likes SAFe, poor SAFe. But it's very much focused on, what's my flavor? What do I like the most? The trend towards, if we just put the word Agile in front of everything, it'll all work out. So we don't do waterfall anymore. We do Agile requirements. Then we give that to the Agile development team, and they write some code. And then we give those to the Agile testers, and they do Agile testing things and all the stuff. Then we give it to our DevOps team, and they do DevOps-y things. Then we give it to our Agile DevOps teams, because the DevOps teams isn't really Agile, but we won't tell them. And then they do Agile DevOps things. And then we end up in the pit of despair where, oh man, there's still 900 bugs, and nobody can log into our online banking system. But we're all Agile. So we're kind of just either misinterpreting what the point of Agile was in the first place, or maybe we just don't need it in some organizations. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So back when I was working for that startup where I was selling you crappy ringtones for $4, we were using a lot of Agile practices just out of necessity. We didn't know what they were, but we would meet every day because we ran the production site and we did new development, and we couldn't figure out a better way to deal with the work. We did retrospectives every Friday, which was going out for beers and talking about how things were going. And we used a practice from Lean and Kanban called work in progress limits. So we would work on 2 small projects and 1 big project at a time. And our sales and business development folks would funnel in work based on what our actual throughput was. So we used a lot of these practices because YouTube didn't exist. There were 3 Agile books. It was sort of, what is our context? How do we have to work differently to support our customers and keep making money for the business? That was it. Very much collaborative. But nowadays you see something like this, or even worse, something like this. And it's just completely overwhelming. I can imagine if your organization is just getting started with Agile, and you want to see what options exist, and you see this, it's like, where do you start? What do you do? Google how to get started with Agile. 15 million results. All with a little bit of a different flavor. You have to start with leadership. You have to start with culture. You have to start with the pilot. You have to start with this process. You have to think of the whole. You can't optimize the parts. You have to optimize the whole. And it must just be completely overwhelming for people that want to move to this nowadays. The scary thing is, with this diagram, when really left side Manifesto people saw it, they lost their minds. Did anybody read any of those blog posts that just went completely mental on the poor guy that created this just to paint a picture of the landscape of Agile? And he just got attacked constantly. How dare you? This is not my Agile. Why can you? And all these blog posts just screaming at this poor guy. And he's like, dude, I just wanted to see all the stuff that was out there so you can see how complex it is. So it's just, there's days I wake up, I'll go into some companies, and I don't even know what the hell Agile is anymore. I don't even know. I walk in, and they go, yeah, we've been doing this Agile thing for a year, and that's where our testers sit, and our project managers are in the next building, and our development guys are on the 18th floor, and why are we doing this again? I don't know. My LinkedIn feed was covered with all this Agile stuff, so I figured we probably should. Just better safe than sorry. So a lot of corporate Me Tooism. But the point is, over the 18 years since the Manifesto has existed, the landscape has become so complex that the process really isn't the problem. It never has been, but I think now maybe we realize that because you Google Agile process and you find 15 million things, that's the easy stuff. Google knows everything. The mechanics are simple. Trying to shoehorn the mechanics into how your company works is the hard part. So there are some alternatives. And like I mentioned with ideas, I saw Larry Smith speak at an entrepreneur conference, and it was a very interesting talk. He said, 50 years from now, I'll be dead. This conference will still exist. It won't be called the Entrepreneur Conference. It'll be called whatever the consultants are calling what we're doing here today with different language. It's the same idea because two things will never, ever change. Ever since societies of people started trading corn and wheat, innovation has been a thing. Some people call it the race to the bottom. Whoever will do it faster, better, cheaper than their competitor wins. And when we get into that vicious cycle, the more we innovate, the more competition we create. And the more competition we create, the more we create more of a need to innovate. And the cycle just keeps going around and around and around. So from his view, all of these ideas that emerge and are innovative when they start, they will all end up in this same state. The companies that really get it will figure it out and move forward, and the ones that don't will get bought up or they'll die off. That's just the way things work in this industry. And it was really great to hear Larry talk about that when it comes to innovation and building new products. He said, the best thing you can do right now for your kids is to teach them how to solve problems. That's it. If they can learn how to solve problems in a creative way, they will have a lifetime of work. Doesn't matter what the context is. And he said, if you're a leader in your organizations, let your people find problems and fix them. That's your job. Your job is to support people to find problems and let them fix it, not tell them how to fix and what to fix. So, the interesting thing is when we get into this Agile stuff and this transformation, who remembers having a plan like this 10 years ago? Did anybody have an anti-transformation plan from 10 years ago? All right, we want to wake up in 2018. We want to make sure that we can get no product out the door. Is that clear? Profits are up. People are happy. This cannot continue. We need more bureaucracy, we need more process, we need more best practice guides, we need a culture of blame, we need a culture of fear, we need processes that contradict our other processes, and we really need to anchor that in the culture. Did anybody go through such a transformation 10 years ago? Nobody? Really? So how did we get here? How did we get to a state where we have a program of 35 people in one resource who is allocated for 10% of his time to write code, his or her time? How did it happen? If we didn't plan our way into it? Of course not. That's stupid. The way it happened over thousands of paper cuts over time. What happens when production goes offline? We throw everybody in a room, in a war room, and everybody yells at each other until it's fixed, and then we all go back to our desks. And then when we release 2 weeks later, well, in some cases 18 months later, depending on your company, the same thing happens. We break all of production, we get everybody in a room, we yell at each other. It happened through little millions of paper cuts. Well, production went down. We now need to lock out production access for everybody except Biff, the one guy who we can trust to actually make sure production doesn't go down. No more pushing stuff to code for developers. Then we ran into another edge case. We missed a sprint commitment, and it was largely because of that one developer whose story points per hour quota wasn't met. Does anybody currently work in an organization using lines of code as a measurement of productivity? I thought that was a myth, and then I worked somewhere that did that. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? That's ridiculous. How many pounds of software do you want me to deliver? It's ridiculous. But it's stupid things like that that just happened over time. Who works in a company that everywhere in the office are these passive-aggressive signs to clean up after yourself? So one day in 1981, Bob forgot to put the toilet seat down, and somebody put a sign on the wall that said, "Please leave this tidy for the next user." And then Bob got offended, and he saw somebody left a fork on the counter in the little kitchen place, and he put up a sign with a mad face on it that said, "Please clean up after yourself." And now that's how we communicate. That's our culture. We live in a culture of passive-aggressive signs. That's what this is speaking to. It's all these little tiny things that we've done over time that have piled on so much cruft onto the organization, we can't get anything done. We didn't plan our way through it. It just sort of happened with all of these events. So what I'm proposing is we don't plan our transformations to get out of it. We try to undo it the same way we got there in the first place, which is by fundamentally changing how we react to these events. If production goes down, instead of yelling and screaming and blaming everyone, what would be the George Costanza way of doing that? If anyone's a Seinfeld fan, if you remember when the episode where he did the opposite, so whatever his gut was, he would do the opposite and everything worked out better. So if you're interested in becoming a George Costanza certified Agile facilitator, let me know. I'm starting an online university next week. But that's the point. We can't get to a new state by planning our way to it, especially nowadays. The world is much too complex, everything changes too fast. We know we kind of want to go in that direction, but we don't want to focus on this. We want to focus on getting to the next foothold. I went into one organization where they had 8 teams practicing Agile, and more or less, nothing worked out. So after a couple of months, none of the coaches were left except for 2 or 3 of us, and people were going on sick leave. They were physically getting ill from working in the environment, and then we have to have our update meeting with the VPs about how Agile's going. Well, here's a little story for you. 2 people on my program physically got ill and had to go on sick leave because of the way you guys treat people. Yeah, but how Agile are we? The foothold is, you can't be Agile if you treat your people like garbage. It's just, you can't make a leap to transform to being an Agile organization if fundamental basic things are not in place first. So let's focus on the next plateau, the next foothold. Let's not worry about this 3-year-long transformation roadmap. Let's figure out what are the 3 most important problems we need to solve this quarter, and only those 3 problems. Then the next quarter, what are the 3 most important problems we need to solve over the next quarter? If you're interested, this is a practice called Mastering the Rockefeller Habits. It's a book by Vern Harnish, and he talks, I use this in an organization. It's exactly how we ran the company. We had massive boulders that we wanted to move, and each quarter we would chip little chunks of that boulder away and only focus on those little small chunks. It's basically business agility before that was trademarked. And that's the whole premise. We all know the direction. The next most important thing, small experiments over time. Because all of our changes will follow this exact same pattern. We bring Agile in, we have the people who are excited and motivated to do it. They kind of go crazy in the organization, they run around, they do meetups, they become evangelists. Who's working in an organization where you have people that refer to themselves as Agile evangelists? Anyone? A few. It's very unstructured, it's very emergent, and then at some point the need to organize things starts to strengthen. You could imagine the first year of this conference was very much emergence. There was probably a bunch of people in a room who loved these ideas and said, let's put on a conference and see what happens. Probably not as much planning to put on a bigger event like this, but things started to emerge. We started to organize, and then we went a little bit too far. So I'll see organizations, they bring in Agile, they let people try these ideas. It's the side of the desk job. It's not very formal. And then we get to a point where somebody outside of the delivery organization notices something different. It could be, well, this program doesn't provide me a monthly status report like all the other ones. What's going on there? And then somebody up here learns that it's because these people down here have tried this Agile stuff, and they say, that can't happen. You have to get those people under control. We need a new VP of Agile to come in and take control of those people. And then our change goes into decline. And then it starts again. So, who's an external consultant? The lesson is never be the first ones in there, ever. Because the first wave goes, and then the intervention after 12 to 18 months is, you're fired. And you get the blame for all of it. And then they hire another consulting firm, they go through the wave again, and it's a little tiny bit better, but then they get fired too, and then the wave happens all over again, and by the time you're the third company, it's awesome. You just kind of walk in with the broom and you sweep up the little mess, and you do the exact same thing as the first two groups, but now they're ready to listen. So that's the rule. So for the people who are not consultants, sorry, you're gonna really screw this thing up a couple of times really bad, so try not to do that. But this is how change happens. Doesn't matter if it's in our societies, in our organizations. That wave of energy happens constantly. The key is the interventions, how we intervene in the systems at the right time. The best time to make a change in your organization is when an existing ritual happens. Who does annual planning and budgeting? Anybody in organizations? That's the perfect time to introduce Agile. 1 month after you've already committed to that 18-month roadmap or however long your time horizon is, that's the absolute worst time to start Agile because you will never get rid of that problem. So if you're serious about doing it, look for those existing rituals and use that as an insertion point to change how we operate. I worked in a public sector organization where we still had the annual budget because that's how things work in government, but we were able to change the process, excuse me, to hand the money out in quarterly increments. So you could do some stuff for a quarter. If it didn't work out, no problem. Shut that program down, start up a new one. Which of course meant we had to get really good at doing liftoffs and spinning teams up quickly. So it was definitely more of a process perspective, but the insertion point was those existing rituals, because sometimes it's that organizational inertia that gets in the way of our changes. It's not that people don't want to do it, it's just, if you've already got that roadmap for 18 months, that's a really hard thing to change because of the impacts that that's going to have for customers, for marketing, for finance, all these different types of things. The last thing I'll say about this, you'll know if you've hit decline when you run into something called co-optation, and that basically just means we wanted to bring Agile into our organization, we brought in this transformation program, but we used our old values to try to make it work. So we say we want collaboration, we want all of these Agile values and principles, we want to change our culture. All right, how are we going to do that? All right, let's get 2 project managers in the room and create the year-long roadmap. That's a good example of co-optation. We've tried to do things the old way to transform to a new state. And you'll notice these patterns in your organization. It doesn't mean you won't get some benefits from process improvement, but then just call it that. Be congruent. Say, we're trying to improve our processes. Don't ignore this culture mindset stuff if you just can't do it. That's what drives people crazy in organizations when we talk about mindset and culture and we behave the exact opposite. And somehow Agile has shamed people that into process improvement is a bad thing. Right? I've seen people at Agile conferences, project managers who show up and they just have legitimate questions. Okay, I have this 3-year-long program. It's $38 million. There's 20 teams, 7 vendors, and whatever. If I wanted to try to do that in an Agile way, what could I do? And you get these experienced Agile people who just go, well, you should descale your organization and have small teams. And they just get all snarky about it. That's not helping. You get people that legitimately want to figure out how to change their organizations, and because Agile's been around for so long, they are sometimes not received very nicely into the community. So we should lead by example. We should be the change that we want to see, help the organizations that want help, and the ones that don't really want it, leave them be. So I found that there's really 5 patterns that seem to be the most important if we're interested in deep transformation. If we really want to change things about how our organizations work, we need to focus on a strong purpose and a cause over urgency for change. In change management, urgency for change is taken from John Kotter's first step of his 8-step change model. Is anyone familiar with the 8 steps of change from John Kotter? So create urgency. First, those ideas predate the internet. Think about that for a second. All of the change methods we cling to today predate the internet. Urgency is different. What's our organization's urgency? Is anybody working for a bank? The urgency will be different in a bank than in a media company. That's just the way it is. In Canada, the banks are what are called an oligopoly, which is the big 6, arguably the big 4, control the ecosystem. So their urgency to change, it's not a case of survive or not survive. It's different. The urgency from the leadership team is different. If the board's putting pressure on the leadership team, thou will not get thou stock options if thou don't be Agile AF, creates a different set of urgency. The urgency for the developer who's sitting at his desk, writes 3 lines of code a week because he has 17,000 pages of documents to fill out, his or her urgency is, I just want to write code. Like, leave me alone and let me write code. So we need a different cause and purpose to rally around, because urgency is a matter of perspective. If you need Agile to save your company, as in you're going to go under, completely different approach that you might want to take in that scenario. So we need to have a cause and a purpose that is created by the people in our organizations. It can't be a poster on a wall that some change person wrote up and communicated out in the comms plan. That doesn't have meaning for me sitting at my desk. So an example could be, who has seen Theory U, or have heard of the Theory U model, if you want to call it that, by Otto Scharma? One organization I worked for, that was their mental model that they picked for transforming. They knew it was going to be a minimum of 10 years before they would even see changes in the culture. They stripped away, why do we exist in this type of industry? Why do we exist as an organization? Something to look at for a homework assignment is something called the Global LAMP Index. Is anybody familiar with that? Or the book Profit for Life by Joseph Bragdon? He talks about how companies that see themselves as a living entity outperform their peers on the stock market by at least 5 to 1, sometimes even 10 to 1, because they take a different view about their organization. They put purpose first, and the profit follows. More often than not, we put profit first. There's nothing wrong with that. Let's just be congruent about it. So Theory U, the basic gist of it is, we're taught that continuous improvement will take us from, if we do small continuous improvements over time, we'll improve. And the basics of this idea, if I oversimplify it, is that's just superficial change. That will never work. You have to go down the U and arrive up on the other side. So this organization spent a year going down the U. They said, we're going to make things a lot worse for our customers. The CEO would do roundtables with 50 people in the entire organization and pull out from them, what are the problems we see here? And if people were holding back, he would challenge them. I don't want to hear everything is good. Tell me really what's going on. I can't be of help and fix it. Completely different attitude. So if we're talking about cause and purpose, this is one idea or model that you can start with or look at. Having meaningful dialogue over just communicating to people that something is changing for them. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Who's heard the little cute quote that people don't resist change, they resist being changed? Peter Senge. Yeah, it sounds cute in a tweet, but it's a bunch of BS in my opinion. People don't resist change, they don't resist being changed. Our society is proof that we as humans love change. But the key is we love change when we feel a purpose to do something differently. So we need to involve our people through meaningful dialogue, and we invert the hierarchy. We have the people who are doing the work and who are in contact with our customers. We facilitate conversations to allow them to do that better, as opposed to thinking at the top and pushing that down at the bottom. So we use practices like lean coffee, and things like conversations with change canvases. One organization, we did a annual summit every year, and we would get 200 people in a room. We would do some facilitated exercise in the context of, here are the problems we want to solve over the next year. What needs to happen to make these problems go away? And 17 teams would create their little one-page change plan. If anyone's familiar with A3 problem-solving reports, exact same idea. All 17 teams went up on stage with their canvas, did 60 seconds. Here's what we're going to work on over the next 6 months. And then we did a retrospective 6 months later. That was the same company that was using Theory U. Very organic, very informal, but about bringing problems to people and saying, here's the problems we see as an organization. What can we do to fix them? Completely different attitude from go make this process work. The third one, I mentioned this a little bit in the opening, response to change over resistance to change. The best you can do as a change person, whether you're a Scrum Master, an Agile coach, an executive, a manager, whatever, is see what the reaction is like. If there's no reaction and nobody cares, that's not change resistance, it just means nobody cares. We have to go find out what's going on. If people are up in arms about this change, oh, why are we doing this? We tried this 2 years ago, it didn't work, blah, blah, blah. We'll say that's resistance. That's just our people telling us something's not quite right. We need to go reconcile this difference of understanding. We don't use resistance as an exit tool or a blaming tool for people. And an example would be in this organization, they were moving to open space working environments. Who's working, who's in an organization where you plowed down all the cubes and you have these highly collaborative workspaces? Did you all buy headphones for people because it's too frickin' noisy and nobody can get any work done? Yeah. So again, one of the things that's changed over Agile over the last decade is it used to be high bandwidth communication via sitting in a team room, and it's been taken to the extreme where you'll have a table, the size of this stage, and there's 15 people working around it, and there's a glass wall, and people are peeking in going, look how collaborative we're going, and these poor people are stuck in a room with no ventilation. And now here we are 10 years later, and the Agile communities kind of went, well, sorry, we didn't actually read any studies about how people collaborate. We just thought it was cool to sit in a room. Clearly we were wrong. So I get, yeah, you need to focus on mental closeness. Near located. Let the people design their own space. Yeah. So that's exactly what happened here. All of you people are going to go into this collaborative working space. Please report at 9 a.m. on Monday morning. And they hated it. They were coming to us as the coaches. They wouldn't go to their managers to say how much they didn't like it. They were coming to us as the coaches. So we put this sign up. This room was more or less the size of that space. There was one way in on this door, so the sign was right here as you would walk in. Sticky notes were on a little shelf so people could write it. What's working well about our space? What needs to be improved? This sent a huge shockwave through the organization. There were things like, if you're ever been a developer or graphic designer and you're used to working on dual monitors, imagine you're now on a 14-inch laptop screen. So just stupid things like that. But with a union at this organization, they couldn't do anything about it. We could see the monitors right there, and we can't move them. Powerless. So this got people talking about, well, what could we do next time? And then when it came time to open up the next co-located working space, it was voluntary. It was, who wants to work in an open space working environment? We're going to be getting together with real estate next Friday. If you want some input, come on in. So it wasn't decided by the people at the top. It was done in a collaborative way. This one's pretty self-explanatory as well. Co-creation over getting buy-in. One of the cornerstones of change management is getting buy-in for the change, which for me is a backwards. If you have to sell something to someone, it's not the right thing in the first place when it comes to change. So focusing on collaborating our way to a future state by getting the people involved who ultimately have a stake in the outcome. This was the same organization with the Theory U. This was the 2-day leadership session that we did, and it wasn't just leaders. It was basically some people were invited because they had to be, and then the rest it was, if you want to be part of this experience, we don't care where you are in the hierarchy, sign up. Very open, very collaborative, and we built Lego Serious Play models talking about, let's build a model that describes a future where these problems don't exist anymore. And then we created all the change canvases, and then 6 months later we came back and did a retrospective. Very much ritual-based. That's what Theory U calls the heartbeat. Get into a groove, get into a ritual. That's how humans are. We're ritualistic creatures. So let's take advantage of that. And the last one, running experiments over just doing change activities. You know, well, our year-long transformation program is done, we checked all the boxes, but nothing's different. So the more uncertainty we have, the shorter our time horizon needs to be for our experiments. And another homework assignment is look up uncertainty reduction theory. One of the things that I've heard over the years in Agile is we have to embrace uncertainty. Who's heard that term before? Embrace uncertainty. So think about it this way. Suppose that you had no financial constraints, no family constraints, or constraints of any kind. Right after this session is done, who would go to the airport and go, yep, I'm going to go there for a month? Who would do that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Who would never, ever do something like that? So some people are more okay with uncertainty than others. So uncertainty reduction theory talks about things like, how do we reduce uncertainty? So let's just not blindly embrace it, because that creates a lot of stress and frustration. Let's work on what can we do to reduce it? What's the most uncertain thing we're faced with right now? What's the 3 experiments we need to start this week to reduce that? And the story for this one was a government organization working on a 3-year-long SAP implementation. And the simplest experiment they could do was to visualize the work so they could see what they were in for. This is a basic necessity. I guess I'm running out of time, but that's okay. This is the last story. This is basic. If you're not visualizing work, don't even bother with the rest of the Agile stuff. The benefits you get from visualizing work will lead you to a better state of managing the work. And that's exactly what happened with these guys. Met in front of it with stakeholders once a week and just talked about the 3 most important risks we have to work on next week, so we don't wake up 3 years later and the system is not implemented. So build your own approach. Take these 5 core ideas and attach practices to them. Start where you are as a change person. We're kind of taught to look at this method because this method has these principles. You know, Scrum has 5 principles. I'm not a believer in that. Methods don't have principles. We do as people. We should bring ourselves to work. Sorry, I'm not going to should you. We have to bring ourselves to work, and it has to be genuine. If I'm working with someone who values control and structure, meet them where they are and help them get what they need. But build practices on top of who you are as the change person or leadership team. Some of the things that you can take a look at, these will be available for download, so you can get these links and information in there afterwards. If you're looking for deeper transformation as opposed to just bringing in a process, these are some ideas you can look at. And if you just want to use Agile practices for process improvement, be okay with that. Say that's what we're doing. People like congruence. And there's nothing wrong with improving your processes as much as it might be right side manifesto. So I'll wait till the pictures go down. There we go. All right. And the last thing is Peter and I are going to demonstrate this in action. So Peter and I are doing a session tomorrow, and we're letting you guys pick. So we have a few different options that we can pick, and whatever is going to be the most valuable for people that show up, that's what we're going to do to demonstrate how to use some of these ideas and practices. So we might have time for a couple of questions, potentially,
Yeah.
I think.
Gibt es Fragen momentan im Raum? Are there any questions that are burning that you don't want to keep until the fishbowl session? Wow, everyone's speechless. I mean, we'll give them a round of applause after this wonderful, wonderful speech and your wonderful insights. By the way, he's such a modest man. He doesn't mention his book. Do purchase his book. Do give the book a read. It is really, really worth it. I'm allowed to say that. You're not, so it is said. Please go online. Please get a copy of the book. Are there any questions right now that you would like to ask that you don't want to keep until the fishbowl session? Yes, third row from the back. I'll run your way very quickly so everyone on the live stream can hear your question as well. All right. Please state your name first so we know who you are.
My name is already stated. Okay, sorry. Is this working?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. I cannot hear myself. My name is Wahid Moradi. I represent one of the biggest banks here. I'm not going to say which one. You said urgency is different in different situations, right? And your example was actually banks. What experience can you give us about what you said, find different approaches on creating urgency in doing agile transformation? Thank you.
I would say, well, first the pattern is most of the ones that I've been inside of or done some work for is they've been transforming to Agile for 10 years. And every year it's the same thing. We're really serious about it this time. We're going to bring in method X. We're going to bring in method Y. We're going to do whatever. And the conversation I like to shift towards is thinking, well, first find a metaphor that makes sense for leaders. So sometimes you can talk about dual operating system. So that's a kind of a concept people can get their brains around. Instead of centralizing your Agile COE or whatever, and they create something and push it outwards, one conversation is, how is that different from every other process we've tried to implement over the last 50, 60 years? What would be different? And it's not to try to come at that as a snarky way. It's to come at from, if this is the way we normally change our processes, and we're just trying to add an Agile process, what is fundamentally going to be different about this? So have a conversation for exploration about that. And using the dual operating system idea is, let's not make it consistent. So let's talk about, a friend of mine likes to say, consistent delivery without prescription. Have a conversation about where is the line that teams are not allowed to cross. So if you're working in capital markets where there's high audit and regulatory constraints, you will use this operating system because there's more risk involved. If you're doing the mobile banking app, you probably don't need a lot of that stuff. So shift the conversation towards the idea of this centralized group being a support group, not a controlling group, and the idea of setting the boundaries. Where can teams pick their own tools? We're trusting teams with multi-million-dollar pieces of software. We won't give them $1,000 for a tool that will dramatically increase their performance. So shift the conversation towards barriers.